Welcome to Caringola's Corner. I'm very privileged to be broadcasting on the Truth and History YouTube website, and look forward to spending a few minutes with you on what I think is a very relevant lesson, especially if you viewed my presentation entitled World Without End. But what we're going to look at today, I've entitled The First Third. The First Third. And I think once we get into it, it will explain itself why I've chosen to go to this topic after A World Without End. But what we're going to look at is the first four trumpets of the book of Revelation. The first four trumpets of the book of Revelation. Now, and I'll be presenting some more stuff as we go on, but those of the historicist school and know very well, by the time we get into the first four trumpets in the book of Revelation, in chapter 8, we have already transpired the first six seals, which deal with the Roman Empire. And I'm skipping that because I want to stay on the topic of the earth. But it is clearly taught in my presentation, and I'll show it to you here in just a second. Protestant historicism, the key to Daniel and Revelation, and also meticulously presented in the present reign of Jesus Christ. And one thing I want to point out before we go to the first four trumpets of Revelation chapter 8 is, if you'll back up a chapter, you'll read where the 144,000 have been sealed. They have already been sealed prior to the blowing of the first four trumpets. So they got sealed in between, in God's time and perspective, the unfolding of the seals, then the blowing of the trumpets. And again, this is all clearly it might be very sensational and spectacular to you now to hear it for the first time, but it's basic historicism 101. And it has been for 3 to 4 centuries. And you haven't been taught that. You've been taught futurism, and you have been taught dispensationalism. And we have mentioned, and will continue to mention many times, that those counter schemes, especially the futurism with the breaking of Daniel's 70 weeks, it's evil. It is a lie. And from the 19th century on, it caught on because men made very serious mistakes. Very serious. And remember, some sins will follow after us, and their sins are following. But nevertheless, we will address and hopefully continue to bring forth an age of correction and an age of restoration. The 144,000 have been sealed. Now, the seventh seal is divided into 7 subsections, known as trumpets. What we're going to witness here is the fall of the Western Roman Empire at the hands of the Gothic hordes. And then we're going to see in the trumpets, in the next presentation of the second third, the Saracen trumpet and first woe, and then of the third third of the Turkish trumpet, which is your second woe. It's all clearly outlined on a silver platter for you in my works and the works of many others. Now, John writes, And I had opened the seventh seal, and there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. And I saw 7 angels which stood before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. Now, silence in heaven in half an hour. Now, remember, you have to be in the world of the language of the prophets, consistent from Genesis through the Revelation, to understand how this revelation, a story being twice told, the scroll was written within and without. And we know where the second story begins. And it's presented to you in these presentations and in these books. But we're looking at a concept of calm before the storm. Calm before the storm, or possibly oppressive silence before the eruption of a terrible battle. As Roman armies and Gothic hordes would square off in Europe, often before the battle, there'd be an oppressive silence. And then, of course, all hell would break loose, and men would start butchering each other. Been doing that for a long time. So these first 4 trumpets are going to encompass 76 years in history to transpire. Henceforth, we kind of look for them to be a short little epic of proclamation in the Revelation. And incorporated in these first 4 trumpets of judgment on the pagan Roman Empire in the West, we're going to be dealing with the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, and the Heruli. In the Old Testament, the blowing of trumpets was often used to proclaim that God was about to judge the enemies of his people. Does Jericho come into remembrance with the blowing of trumpets? So we're using a metaphor again being applied. In Joshua 6, we read of the 7 trumpets of ram's horns. And so what's happening here is another seemingly invincible power is going to fall. Jericho was quite a fortress, and it could not be beaten by the armies of the Hebrews. God had to intervene, and he did. I've been to Jericho. Now, I want to read you a little bit, abridge an excerpt from E.B. Elliott's Horae Apocalypticae about that silence in heaven. And he goes on and he writes that, but what of the half hour's predicated duration of silence, or rather, as it were, half an hour? I incline to consider St. John's, as it were, as meaning that it appeared to and affected him as a half-hour stillness before a storm might do in common life or in common nature. Very short interval. Well, we have, and we haven't covered the seals, but we have an emperor who died in the time of the 6th seal named Theodosius. He died in January of 395. Probably the epic of the opening of these, or the 7th seal's opening. And then Gibbon said at this time the Gothic nation was in arms. That, quote, the tempest of the barbarians, as he elsewhere calls it, was to subvert the foundations of the Roman Empire. And another historian said the 4th century was set in storms. And these are going to be portrayed, these trumpets, as storms, as we will see in the magnificent language of the prophets. Now, verse 6. And the 7 angels which had 7 trumpets prepared to sound. And again, I've already mentioned about Theodosius and his death in AD 395, and the historians look back and see the transition between the history of the prior 5 seals merging into the 6th seal, and the Gothic nations being in arms. And before that, we got to look at verses 3, 4, and 5 of chapter 8. Now it says, another angel came down and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, given unto him much incense, that he offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. Well, we know this has to be Jesus Christ, because he is clearly the only one that is given the authority to offer the prayers of the saints. Paul very clearly in 1 Timothy 2 and 5, there's one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. So again, this beautiful symbolic nature of this prophecy. The smoke of the incense, verse 4, the prayers of the saints ascended up before God. Angel took the censer, filled the fire of the altar, cast it into the earth, and there were thunders and lightnings and an earthquake. Storms! Preparing to engulf the Western Roman Empire of the Roman earth of Bible prophecy, territory encompassing the Great Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. This revolution was not only, like an earthquake, but thunders and lightnings gave it the appearance of approaching storms of judgment. Pagan Rome is being judged for her 9 centuries, basically, of a lot of wickedness, but especially her wickedness towards the Christian church in its first 3 centuries of trying to survive against the horrific persecutions of pagan Rome. Now, it's noticed that we're going to read and we're going to look at these. There's a term called the third part that's going to appear in these storms. Well, like I said in World Without End, the world is ending. Well, ending what? What's ending? Well, here we have a third part of the earth being judged, and if you're just thinking about the whole globe, you've missed it. Because in the Greek, the word when the earth appears in these judgment is Ghay, pronounced Gi, which means a region. A region of the earth. A region at this time of relevance is the Roman earth. And it falls in 3 parts. And we're going to look at the first third, known as 4 trumpets. And they perfectly transpired in history. Gay, a region. And it's also noted that even before the horrific war started, which ran from AD 400 to AD 476, as we're going to see, in 337, the empire was tripartite politically, which seemed to be another forewarning of the judgment that was coming. Now, we're going to see in these 3 third parts presentations that this first third business is taken care of by the Goths, and the second third by the Saracens or the Mohammedan on their third part of the territory, and the third, which is the first woe, is by the Turks and their third part of the east. We will see that these trumpets will fall on the land, the sea, the rivers, and her leaders. And again, 400 to 476 AD. this transpired. If you're looking for trumpet judgments in a final 7-year tribulation period, you've been fooled and lied to by the futurists who have been fooled and deceived by one of Satan's masterpieces, a man who penned, and his name was Francisco Ribera, a Roman Catholic Jesuit priest, wanted to attack the Reformation fathers, who were Roman Catholic priests that God had called and opened the scriptures to. First trumpet, the Goths, 400 to 410. First angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and there was cast upon the earth. The Gi and the third part of these were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. So a third part of the region, the Gi, there was a horrific scorched earth policy, and on top of that, hail, the origin of desolation was from the north. And hail, when hailstorms come upon Europe, they come down with ferocity from the north. The historian Claudian compared the invasion of the Goths to a hailstorm. Now, you'll see in this book, but I want to show you again that how there's a little drawing there of the Mediterranean Sea and the Roman earth around it, and how it fell in third parts. And we're going to be talking about this part, the West, falling, pagan Rome being judged by God and being collapsed in this third of judgment. The Goths were led by Alaric. They led a scorched earth policy. Everything was burned. Whereas we're going to see that in the fifth trumpet, or the first woe, that they preserved the earth. Just the opposite of what the Goths did. We'll get to that. And many of you have already been there, because I know thousands upon thousands upon thousands have been through the Revelation seminar and have read this book. But there's always somebody new tuning in. Second trumpet, the Vandals. Second angel sounded, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became as blood. Creatures in the sea that had life died, and a third part of the ships were destroyed. This is under the Vandals. Their leader, Genseric. He was known in history as the tyrant of the seas. And in my book and in my presentations, I point you to the best historical minds over the last 3 and 4 centuries who ever wrote on this subject, what they had to say. It was amazing how much Edward Gibbon identified in the fall of the Roman Empire, and it seems like he was writing right out of the Revelation using the symbolic language. Many portions of the sea were turned to blood as the Roman ships were sunk, and they not only let them flay around the water, they butchered them while they were in the water. Rome itself was taken and ravaged for 15 days. The Vandals, second trumpet, third part of the waters, under Genseric, the tyrant of the seas. Third trumpet, the Huns, AD 451, verse 10 of Revelation 8. Third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, on a third part of the rivers, the fountains, and the waters. The name is called wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and it goes on to tell us that many died because of the poisonous waters. Attila, or Attila the Hun, is known in history as the scourge of God. Gibbon said that the barbaric princes could not presume to gaze with a steady eye on what they deemed his divine majesty. His divine majesty. The Rhine, the upper Danube, and the Po rivers, the Huns, Gibbon wrote, he was the master of these rivers. And the slaughter took place on these rivers. And, you know, the Romans really knew, that caught them by surprise, the Huns, when they appeared around 440 AD. The Romans knew little or nothing, and it was like just a blazing meteor, like the prophecy says, coming out. And he had 800,000 men massed upon the banks of the Danube River. And the butchering was so horrific. Those rivers, their waters turned to poison and blood, and continued to poison the waters for many years after the horrific slaughtering in the rivers at the hands of the scourge of God, Attila the Hun. Right there in your Revelation. You've read about him in the history books. John beat you to him. Now, fourth angel sounded, and a third part of the sun was smitten, third part of the moon, and third part of the stars was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and night likewise. The western third of the Roman Empire, as I've mentioned over the years many times, sun and moon and stars are symbolic for the political heavens of Rome. Not only of Rome, but we have, before I go on here, in the, let me get it here. In May, August, many of you have received this edition of Truth in History. I have an article, was privileged to allow an article to be published about the language of the prophets and what the sun and the moon stars symbolically represent. And we went to Isaiah 13 and the fall of Babylon, and how the falling of the sun and the moon and the stars is the falling of the government. It's clearly proclaimed. Well, here we're having the government finally collapse under the fourth trumpet of Rome pagan in the west. Third part of the sun, the moon, and the stars. That's why the New Jerusalem doesn't have a sun and moon and stars, because Christ will be the light of it. True Israel will be the government of the nations. We won't need the world that Christ was talking about, said, my power don't come from this world. And we address that in World Without End. AD 476, Rome pagan collapses under the Heruli by Odoacer. And it was said that the name of the office of the Roman Emperor of the West should be abolished. Romulus Augustus was banished. This occurred 76 years after the sounding of the first trumpet. There's a book, as I begin to wrap up here. There's many great historicist works out there, but one of them is by John S. Fox, A Flood of Light Upon the Book of Revelation. Great book. I encourage you to get it and have it in your historicist library. And by the way, don't just stick it up there, read it. Show yourself approved unto God and study. But this is what he had to say concerning these verses. Earth, sea, rivers, and sun, the latter typifying the brightest center of the prophetical earth, i.e. the ruling center of Rome itself. It is interesting to note that in God's judgments of pagan Rome, and later in his judgments on papal Rome, the exact same symbols are used later on in the Revelation. Further on, in chapter 16, we shall reach the first of 7 vials of God's wrath being poured out in judgment upon the papal Roman earth. And there are also used the same pictures again with the same symbols used in the same order: earth, sea, rivers, and sun. End quote. Verse 13 of Revelation chapter 8. And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud verse, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpets, the three angels which are yet to sound. Three more trumpets. They're revealed as woes or catastrophes. The next woe, which will be the next or the second third, is the Saracens. They're the first woe. The Saracens, I know it, but you study, the picture comes very clear, and it makes absolute sense. The second woe that had its terror on a third of the Roman earth was going to be the Turkish hordes. And both of these woes have magnificent divine time measures, which were perfectly fulfilled, a day for a year in history. Third woe being the seven pouring of the seven vials. We are now living in the seventh vial in the book of Revelation. The seals, the trumpets, the first two woes, and 6 vials of the third woe have all passed in history. Don't let anybody fool you. God, don't let anybody tell you that for 2,000 years of history of the bride of Christ, his people, true Israel, and of the church, that God had nothing to say. He had plenty to say. He mapped it out, and he intended for us to know it. Jesus is Semper Fi. God bless.